This is Citations Needed with Nima Shirazi and Adam Johnson.
Welcome to Citations Needed, a podcast on the media, power, PR, and the history of bullshit. I'm Nima Shirazi.
I'm Adam Johnson.
You can follow the show on Twitter at CitationsPod, Facebook Citations Needed, and become a supporter of the show through patreon.com/Citations Needed podcast. All your support through Patreon is so incredibly appreciated as we are 100% listener funded.
Yes, if you can, please support the show on Patreon. As always, we'd be very grateful. Supporting us on Patreon helps keeps the episodes themselves free and helps keeps the show sustainable.
Here's why creating single-payer healthcare in America is so hard, explained Harold Pollack in Vox in 2016. The benefits of climate action are diffuse and hard to pin down, shrugged a Foreign Affairs article in 2020. A nuanced view of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, presented Aliza Pilichowski in the Jerusalem Post in 2023.
These are all examples of something that we call nuance trolling. The insistence that some major beneficial development like single-payer healthcare, ending wars or a bombing campaign, or the mitigation or even cessation of climate change is impossible because the situation is too nuanced, too complex. The plan too lacking in detail, the goal too hard to achieve, the public isn't behind it, or some other bad faith quote-unquote concern that makes bold action an impossibility. Nuance trolls present power-serving defeatism as savvy pragmatism, claiming over and over again that no good, meaningful change can happen because no version of it will simply ever work.
Nuance and complexity, of course, are real, legitimate things. Political, social, environmental, and economic dynamics are often complicated, yes, but nuance trolls abuse this self-evident truism, using it as a mode of analysis and theory designed to weaken and water down movements for change that seek actual material solutions to political problems, and instead promote inaction to ensure the continuation and maintenance of the already oppressive status quo.
On today's episode, we'll examine the trope of the nuance troll, analyze the media's selective evocation of quote-unquote complexity and quote-unquote nuance in order to stifle urgent movements for social justice, reducing poverty, curbing climate chaos, and ending occupation and war.
Later on the show, we'll be speaking with Natasha Leonard, a columnist for The Intercept. Her work has also appeared in The Nation, Book Forum, Dissent, The New York Times, among many other outlets. Natasha is also the associate director of the Creative Publishing and Critical Journalism graduate program at the New School for Social Research, and the author of 2 books, the most recent of which is Being Numerous, Essays on Non-Fascist Life, which was published by Verso Books in 2019.
A lot of the same centrist commentariat and political voices are saying, oh, we live in these uncertain times. Gosh, the uncertainty. Who could know? I can't possibly point to knowing and understanding because there's so much that is unknown. And of course, there is a lot of uncertainty. I'm not denying that there's uncertainty and that attending to complexities and difficult things that we need to figure out and build knowledge around is crucial. But what that does in the same way is this really diversionary, obfuscatory work of meaning we're not attending to what we're actually pretty certain of.
So similar to other forms of anti-politics we've talked about, like the obsession with polarization or gerontocracy discourse or purity politics,
civility.
The goal of nuance trolling is to make politics not be politics. It's to make it a kind of sport for elites who've mastered it, and you need to kind of sit down because it's very complex and you're kind of a drooling idiot, and we got it figured out because we have PhDs from Ivy League schools, and it's extremely head patting, right? Because the assumption is that you have all these slogans and simple answers, and it's actually really complicated. Now, as we laid out at the intro, and we want to reiterate here, it's not as if many problems aren't genuinely complicated, a point we will reemphasize in this episode. It's the evocation of complexity and nuance in a bad faith way, because again, that's sort of a truism. Obviously things are complex, especially when you're dealing with 330 million people or some sort of with varying interest. Things are complex is sort of a no shit obvious thing to say. The problem with it, aside from its bad faith, is that it fundamentally gets the causality backwards in a lot of major issues, which is that historically the way things change is not through eggheads and lawyers figuring out the details and then things change. There's a broad political movement, a popular movement to change X, Y, and Z. And then that is agreed upon. And then there's a deadline set for that change. And then the eggheads and then the lawyers come by afterwards and sort of figure out how best to implement it. And what the nuance trolling does is it sort of inverses that. It says, actually, we need to get all the eggheads and lawyers to sign off on something as a way of creating political impotence and undermining political will.
If you don't have everything figured out right now, before the movement kicks off or before we're expecting to see broad political consensus, well, therefore you haven't thought it through enough. And therefore, this can't actually happen. The idea of nuance is like a virtue unto itself, is an entire mode of political thought and discussion, rather than nuance being something that can be used in service of action or decision making. The idea of nuance as being stifling by design.
And what we're arguing in this episode is that it's both ahistoric and asymmetrical. It's ahistoric because historically, social movements that have meaningfully improved society, such as they have happened, are not sorted out by MBAs first and then they happen. They're usually the elites or political institutions responding to populist uprisings, and they have no choice but to reform. Secondly, it's asymmetrical because extremely violent and very dangerous, ambitious projects that serve power are not held to this kind of nuance. For example, invading Iraq was not held to any kind of nuance or complexity standards. It was just a thing we had to do. Invading Afghanistan was just a thing we had to do. Supporting the bombing of Gaza and killing tens of thousands of people from the U.S. Congress was never really something we had to discuss. Expanding the U.S. military in general is never something we have to sort of hold to this nuance standard. It's just something that's self-evidently something we have to do. And any kind of deaths or disease or famine that result from that are seen as kind of, well, that's just the way it is. So it's both ahistorical and asymmetrically applied because, again, nuance, while it is objectively a virtue and is good, as a sort of slogan, as a capital N nuance, can be employed pretty much whenever you want to undermine any kind of build-up towards mass movement.
Right. The situation that's already occurring is the given. So any pushback to that, let's say arguing that civilian populations should not be held in captivity and bombed mercilessly by nuclear armed powers, that then gets put to, well, but have you really dug into the centuries-long history of the Zionist movement? Or have you really gotten into the complexity of the Sykes-Picot Agreement? Because then we really need to unpack what it's like. The bombing is going to continue, and that's the given. Anything against that is going to be subject to this nuance trolling in order to maintain the way things are, as you said, Adam. And the media is deeply implicated in this because so much of the communication about, whoa, slow down, change can't happen that fast, comes through the media. So examples of this extend far back into our history. One early example comes from an article in The Economist, dated May 21st, 1853, in which the magazine warned that slavery couldn't be abolished immediately because enslaved people would therefore be helpless and abandoned if emancipation happened all at once. The article implied that the abolitionist movement couldn't answer logistical questions about the end of slavery and thus was not being realistic. Here is an excerpt from that piece from 1853. Quote, "It appears by the latest census that there are in the United States 3,204,093 slaves, owned by about 3 million people and valued at 1,200 millions of dollars. How can such a mass be emancipated? Where are they to go? How are they to live? How could they be employed? They could not get their own living. Are the planters to vacate the land for them? Are they to give their estates up to their slaves? Are they to become the servants of the Negroes? Immediate and unconditional emancipation is simply an impossibility. Exeter Hall might as well resolve that the sun shall not shine or that the rivers shall not run into the sea." End quote.
Now, of course, that is what happened. The Emancipation Proclamation freed, at least nominally, millions of slaves, and then within less than 2-3 years, that was accomplished because the political will and the top-down order by the U.S. military made it so. And of course, there was tons of logistical problems caused by this that the Union Army had to manage, Ulysses S. Grant being one of them. And you know what? They managed it. It wasn't perfect. They made mistakes. There was logistical issues with, whether or not they went to Union Army camps, whether or not they got plots of land, which of course they ended up doing. But the logistical problems were far, far less than just continuing slavery ad infinitum, right? That's sort of the key.
Well, right. And what's also kind of ironic here is that The Economist, a British magazine, is speaking out against the abolition of slavery when slavery has already been abolished in British territories by that time. And as we've mentioned before on the show, the New York Times across the pond trafficked in a similar hemming and hawing over abolition in an 1859 editorial that scolded abolitionists here in the United States for talking about slavery too damn much. Now, according to the so nuanced editors of the New York Times, there were plenty of process critiques to make regarding how to go about getting rid of a system that literally enslaved generations of human beings. These were some of their concerns. Quote, emancipation, whenever it comes, must be the work of the slave states themselves. They must adopt it from a conviction of its necessity to their own well-being. It will not come as an isolated act, complete at once and by itself, but as a result from other acts, as the effect of separate and preparatory causes. End quote. The article goes on to explain what this might look like to avoid abolishing the institution in one fell swoop. Quote, laws to prevent the separation of families, to limit the sale of slaves on execution for debt, to give them the right now enjoyed by the slaves of Cuba of purchasing their own freedom, to connect them permanently with the soil, as in the old predial system of Europe, would soon press themselves by their obvious justices and humanity upon the attention of Southern legislators and prepare the way, in the public mind as well as in the condition of affairs, for the ultimate removal of slavery itself. No system of immediate and total abolition, either with or without compensation, can ever commend itself to the sober judgment of our people. End quote.
Where this bad faith concern really hit its, I would say, its peak in many ways was the Vietnam War, which was routinely presented as something that was very complex and nuanced and required a complicated, years-long process, even if one kind of accepted the increasingly popular liberal or left-wing premise that the war had to end, and that the far left, the hippies, the anti-war protesters, the Black Panthers, etc., were sort of just unrealistic and were working in a simplistic, slogan-filled universe that didn't quite understand the nuances and the reality of the situation on the ground. For example, in his 1967 book, The Bitter Heritage, Vietnam and American Democracy, presidential historian Arthur Schlesinger, he claimed to offer a, quote, solution to the Vietnam War in a chapter entitled The Middle Course. Schlesinger called the proposal of a ceasefire on the ground in South Vietnam, quote, possibly very dangerous, unquote, and added that, quote, no serious person has suggested that the U.S. undertake a unilateral ceasefire. The very same year the book was published, in 1967, Martin Luther King, in fact, did call for a unilateral ceasefire. Instead of what he deemed a reckless approach, Schlesinger recommended measures like applying moderate force, quote unquote, tapering off the bombing, and a promise to the Vietnamese communists of a future in Vietnam. Arthur Mary McCarthy, who at the time supported an immediate end to the war, challenged Schlesinger's prescriptions, writing a critique of it in 1967 entitled Vietnam Solutions. That same year, in 1967, the New York Review of Books published an exchange between McCarthy and writer Diana Trilling, who critiqued McCarthy's, quote, refusal to deal with a communist victory in South Vietnam, unquote. Trilling wrote, quote, I too oppose this war and urge our withdrawal from Vietnam, later adding, quote, but even as I take the stand, I confront the grim reality that in withdrawing from Vietnam, we consign untold numbers of Southeast Asian opponents of communism to their death and countless more to the abrogation of the right of protest, which we American intellectuals hold so dear, unquote.
Yeah.
Well, case closed, and I guess we have to keep the war going.
Well, nothing to do. Untold numbers.
Yeah, no, it's too complex. Yeah, sorry, we have to, yeah.
Yeah, let's just keep slaughtering millions of people. So interestingly, in Mary McCarthy's piece, Vietnam Solutions, she actually wrote about a tactic of nuance trolling, though she didn't use that terminology, as applied to those who were against the war. McCarthy wrote this, quote, if a critic of the war says, get out, the only sane answer, his opponent pounces. How? And he sits back smiling. He has won. The tables are turned, and the critic is on the defensive. If he tries to outline a plan for rapid withdrawal, conscious that 464,000 troops plus their civilian supporting services cannot be pulled out overnight, and what about the loyal Vietnamese? Should they be left behind, or do we owe them an airlift to Taiwan? The plan inevitably appears feeble and amateurish in comparison with the massed power and professionalism of the war actually being waged. End quote.
boy, where have we heard that one? I mean, that was very popular in Iraq. It's currently popular, of course, in the bombing of Gaza. There's this idea that the status quo never needs to have the burden of proof, that the people who want to stop the horrific thing need to have a 500-page PowerPoint presentation with a detailed logistics plan, because the alternative never needs to prove itself. Only those opposing the status quo have to have this sort of infinitely fractorial nuance, right? It has sort of, you can keep zooming in and you have to have more detailed plans and more detailed plans because you can keep moving the goalpost.
Exactly. So these tactics that McCarthy described back in 1967 persist to the present day in all manner of discussion, not only when it comes to war, bombing, and aggression, but also when it comes to things like healthcare. A January 2016 Vox article written by Harold Pollack emphasized the complexity and difficulty of designing and implementing single-payer healthcare. Under the headline, quote, "Here's why creating single-payer healthcare in America is so hard," end quote, Pollack contended that, quote, "the pitch for single-payer healthcare is admirably simple," end quote, but countered with assertions that single-payer would cause transition issues and be disruptive to people who already had insurance and liked it. Pollack added that those who stood to benefit the most from single-payer would be poor people, but spent more time sympathizing with, quote, affluent people who would face large tax increases to finance a single-payer system, end quote.
In September of 2017, New York Magazine published a piece by Jonathan Chait entitled "Bernie Sanders' Bill Gets America 0% Closer to Single-Payer," unquote, in which he makes many of the same argument of Harold Pollack, stating that he agreed with single-payer in theory, right? They always sort of agree in theory. We agree we should leave Vietnam in theory.
We don't like the bad thing, but we can't possibly imagine why anything would be less bad.
But we can't do anything about it because it's complex. Insisted that 155 million Americans who already had healthcare represented in Super Bowl barrier, and that the issue of how to move them all into government-run system is, quote, "is not a detail to work out. It is an entire problem." Chait added that Lyndon Johnson, Hillary Clinton, and Barack Obama failed to undo the private system, which is weird because they imply they really wanted to. And at the very least, Clinton and Obama certainly did not really want to.
Everyone's done everything they possibly could already.
There's nothing more we can do. It's too complex. Neither Pollack and Chait were, of course, interested in exploring the fact that most people don't like private insurance, and by most indications would be happy to transition to a single payer. A 2021 study in the Journal of American Medical Association found that, quote, "individuals with employer-sponsored and individually purchased private insurances were more likely to report poor access to healthcare, higher cost of care, and less satisfaction with care compared to individuals covered by publicly sponsored insurance programs," unquote. This is a classic kind of depends how you ask the question polling situation, where if you ask people, do they like their private insurance, because they're comparing it to the alternative not having any at all, they will always say they like it. It has very high, people's individual insurance has very high approval ratings because they know the alternative. But when you ask people, do you support a single-payer healthcare system similar to what they have, say, in Britain, is kind of NHS style, it polls, depending on how you ask the question, somewhere between 60 and 70%. So again, this is kind of how you poll it, how you sort of frame it. And the Jonathan Chaits of the world and Harold Pollacks of the world aren't interested in changing how people see the world. They're not interested in using the bully pulpit or changing the kind of moral framework of any particular issue. They just want to sort of put their finger to the wind, see which way it's blowing, and say, it's too complex, it's too hard, it takes too much convincing, rather than actually using their media influence to change things, to convince people of things, right? Politics is about responding to the status quo and kind of curating it and massaging it and managing it. It's not about changing what the status quo is. And I wrote at the time for the Los Angeles Times, I wrote an article in 2017 critiquing Jonathan Chait's speech where I accused him of nuance trolling. We've had this as a sort of mode of critique for many years now. Am I allowed to quote myself? Is that what's against the rules?
Sure.
Okay, I'm going to quote myself. Quote, "And if the demand for nuance seems reasonable enough, consider that pundits rarely require it when it comes to military interventions," as I noted earlier. Chait and others set this issue aside when it comes to invading Iraq in 2003, for instance. The idea at the time was, this is an urgent threat. We will rush to solve it and sort out the details later. With an estimated 45,000 people dying a year because of a lack of healthcare, and almost half of the money raised on GoFundMe is used to pay medical bills, we must ask, how is this crisis any less urgent? Of course, Jonathan Chait was a huge supporter of the Iraq War. None of his articles promoting the Iraq War, up to and including one that says, "Give war a chance," was the headline, "Give war a chance" in the New Republic. Did he actually seem concerned about the nuances of destroying the entire government and civil society of Iraq and what horrors that may unleash? But needless to say, trying to convert people politically from private health insurance, a single payer, would, under Chait's metric, cause more harm than invading Iraq, which killed upwards of 500,000 to 1 million people, depending on your estimate.
This trope is also popular when it comes to things like climate action. A foreign affairs piece from April 2020 headlined, "The Paths to Net Zero," claimed that climate action hadn't happened because its benefits were, quote, diffuse and hard to pin down. That collective action was, quote, difficult to organize. And that, quote, the profound uncertainty about what lies ahead makes it hard to move decisively, end quote. So, the conclusion of this foreign affairs piece? Policymakers shouldn't bother with all that complicated stuff. They should instead direct investment towards so-called clean tech, potentially made by the companies already responsible for contributing the most to climate change. And to what else? Public-private partnerships. The piece went on to criticize then pending climate legislation in the US and Europe as impractical, stating this, quote, "The much-touted Green New Deal in the United States is still weak on specifics. And the more concrete it becomes, the harder it may be to form a supportive political coalition around it. Its counterpart, the European Green Deal, is further along, yet also faces political challenges and administrative hurdles," end quote. So therefore, let the planet burn, because you know what?
Yeah. No rush, no urgency, no sense that like something has to be done. The status quo can kind of be, we can get there. It's like the Honda commercial I saw where it says, we're on a path to be carbon neutral by 2050. It's like, oh, you're on the path as a corporation to be carbon neutral. No rush.
Yeah. Take your time. Well, I love also how if there aren't enough specifics, then we need to, I don't think there's really enough nuance here. There aren't any details. And then, as was just quoted in that foreign affairs piece, it says the more concrete that these legislative efforts or these policies or these solutions are made, the more detail added. Well, now it's just harder to actually get anyone to agree with it. Now it's just too complex, right? So it's either not complex enough, or then it jumps immediately to too complex, because the point is actually not to change.
It's a skeleton key. You can use it for anything. I mean, anything's either too complex or not complex enough or not popular enough. And it's like, yeah, every social movement in history has been unpopular before it's popular. That's how things become popular, right? So there's kind of two modes. There's logistics, there's sort of political popularity, right? You sort of say, oh, not enough people support it. This is very popular when people were trying to concern troll single payer, even when polls showed, it'd be 60, 70%, is that there's always, people don't really like their healthcare. They're not going to want to do it. It's like, yeah, because you have to convince them of things. That's what politics is. It's a fundamentally evangelical enterprise. And you're sort of saying, you know what? No, it's not worth it. We don't need to go to this town and convert anyone. They're already really hardcore religious freaks. Let's just move on. I mean, well, then what are you doing being an evangelical? Like, you're just sort of saying, let's not do anything. And you see this a lot with foreign policy more broadly. Again, we saw this during the Bernie Sanders run. This was a very popular mode. The way one signaled they were very serious adult pundits in the room was anytime Bernie Sanders said, hey, this thing's evil or this thing's really important, we do better, it's too pie in the sky. It's not nuanced enough. Vox, which was the ground zero for this kind of writing during the 2016 and 2017 election and leading up to the 2020 election, Jennifer Williams at Vox wrote a piece in 2017, a headline, Bernie Sanders wants world peace and prosperity, but he has no idea how to get there. Okay. The piece, published in response to a speech that Bernie Sanders delivered shortly before, chided Sanders for a lack of detail in its calls for the U.S. to shift from a default position of war to one of diplomacy when addressing international conflicts. Author Jennifer Williams quoted an excerpt from the Sanders speech, which reads as follows. We must offer people a vision that one day, maybe not in our lifetimes, but one day in the future, human beings on this planet will live in a world where international conflicts will be resolved peacefully, not by mass murder, unquote. Now, this is sort of the way politics works, especially when he planned on running for office in 2020, is that you build a moral vision, you campaign in poetry, you kind of lay out a vision. And then from that, you sort of follow that up. But this was not sufficient for Williams, who, of course, needed to tisk this. Now, she made a perfunctory reference to it being a laudable stance, right? This kind of patronizing, like, oh, the kids mean well. But she quickly articulated that this pie in the sky thinking, which is to say reducing mass death and building foreign policy around war and weapons shipments, was simply unrealistic and not supported by quote unquote concrete ideas. She wrote, quote, he offered a moving portrait of the world as it should be. What he didn't offer, though, was any sort of new or innovative or even particularly concrete ideas for how to achieve this grand utopian vision. Of course, big political speeches like this often present the world as it should be and don't get bogged down in the details. But especially when it comes to foreign policy, these details really do matter. Unquote. Williams would basically go on to defend military intervention and drone strikes in West Asia and the Middle East, as well as the U.S. backing of Saudi's war in Yemen, suggesting that there is simply no alternative to addressing the threats of ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and Houthi rebels. Babies just have to die from U.S. bombs. There's sort of nothing else we can really do. And again, this is because, it's a speech by Bernie Sanders. What exactly was he supposed to sort of offer? And that's how you sort of signal yourself as someone who's serious.
Oh, that guy's standing up there at the Lincoln Memorial saying, I have a dream, but he's pretty short on details, I gotta say.
Yeah, we're short on details. How are you going to really figure that one out? Jennifer Williams is now the deputy editor at Foreign Policy and organizes debates for the Emirati government through Doha Debates. So that's how you sort of ingratiate oneself to the blob.
Yeah.
We saw this a lot once Biden took office, and there was a reconcentrated effort to end the Saudi bombing in Yemen, which had a ceasefire, but could end at any minute. And Saudi Arabia was still blockading Yemen, preventing important medical trips, food, fuel, and against the so-called Houthi rebels. And this was the sort of default posture, which is that, yeah, we should end, but it's more nuanced than you're sort of letting on.
So at the end of 2022, there was a short-lived attempt to revive the War Powers Resolution effort to end direct U.S. participation in the Saudi-led war on Yemen. Major media were quick to emphasize the repercussions of a potential WPR in order to run interference for the Biden White House and its ongoing backing of Saudi Arabia in general. So one instance of this kind of nuanced trolling comes from a piece from Politico that quoted Jonathan Lord, the director of the Middle East program at the Center for a New American Security, a DC-based think tank. Lord said this, quote, Riyadh has largely abided by its commitments under the ceasefire that was implemented earlier this year. At this juncture, the WPR would only serve to punish the Saudis for past sins, which is ultimately unhelpful in incentivizing their continued and future cooperation in achieving a lasting peace agreement in Yemen, end quote. It's worth noting that two big funders of the Center for a New American Security, CNAS, are the U.S. Defense Department and weapons manufacturer Northrop Grumman. Therefore, the think tank itself has an obvious stake in the United States' ongoing backing of Saudi Arabia and other military efforts.
Yeah, and I wrote at the time for my Substack, the column, I wrote at the time an article on Q, Saudi and weapons contractor-funded pundits attack Bernie Sanders' Yemen's War Powers Resolution, which was basically making the same arguments that there was various Saudi-funded think tanks that suddenly had a very nuanced interpretation of the events. It was very complex. It was very oversimplified, namely the Middle East Institute, whose biggest donors that year were Saudi Arabia and UAE, which donated $1.7 million and $233,000 respectively. In addition to CNAS, as you mentioned, was also the Arab Gulf Institute in Washington, which was quoted repeatedly by various outlets at the time, talking about how complex the situation was. They were created by the Saudi and UAE governments, which funded them, and also the Saudi Arabia Foundation, which is 100% funded by Saudi Arabia. So the Saudi-funded, weapons contractor-funded groups, they didn't want to come out and say, like, yeah, there's tens of thousands of people dying of famine and being bombed. And while there was a temporary pause at the time, Saudi Arabia was threatening to restart the war. They didn't want to come out and say, like, oh, we support continue bombing the poorest country in the Middle East. Because that sounds bad, right? You sort of can't say that. So you say, actually, it's really complex. We need leverage against the Houthis. There needs to be a ceasefire that's this, this, and this. And it's like, okay, but when you're making that argument, you're basically saying that the continued collective punishment of the civilian population of Yemen is worth it as a way to achieve a political ends. But just make that argument. But you can't make that argument. So what you do is you say, it's very complex. It's, fog of war. It's not so simple. You can just the U.S. can stop supporting Saudi Arabia. And it's like, well, okay. I mean, we can't stop supporting a theocratic dictatorship that takes a bone saw to journalists because it's so fucking complex. And again, like we've mentioned, this nuance is not really afforded to other countries. If the U.S. started arming and funding Russia's invasion of Ukraine, people wouldn't come along and say, it's very complex. Ukraine needs to do X, Y, and Z first. We would sort of view it in simple moral terms. But when the U.S. is doing an objectively horrific and bad thing and supporting objectively despotic governments, Suddenly it's just, who can say? It's very complicated. It's a Rashomon situation. Do you know the 7,000 year history? Can you tell me who the, 6th century kingdom in Yemen was? Oh, you don't know? Okay, well, then you can't comment on it because you're not at the Saudi Arabia Institute forum sponsored by Raytheon. And it's like, okay, well, everyone's so fucking complicated. And you have these mercenary PhDs who sort of appear to the woodwork and tisk, the sort of radical Bernie Sanders crowd for wanting to end such an obviously evil war. And that's the line you take, because if you can't defend the status quo as such, whether it be Vietnam or slavery or shitty healthcare system, you do the next best thing, which is a processed critique vis-a-vis nuance. It's it's very complex because it's the sort of thing you do.
Yeah, which is exactly what has been happening since before the establishment of Israel in 1948, and in the subsequent 75 years, to always have there be some kind of nuance that's too complex, too historical, too fraught, too complicated, to actually just say that, colonizing a land that is not your own is bad, or apartheid is bad, or ethnic cleansing is bad, or genocide is bad. So we have all of these historic kind of timelines that came out after October 7th. Now, of course, we've seen this for years and decades past, but more recently, Vox on October 19th, 2023, published a piece headlined, quote, "A Timeline of Israel and Palestine's Complicated History," end quote. The piece summarizes events from the 1917 Balfour Declaration, in which the British government effectively signs on to establish, quote, "a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine," and then goes through all of these other kind of historic events, unpacking all the nuance and complexity. But again, this is all a way to avoid the simple fact that already Israel was committing genocide in Gaza. All of this was to sort of distract from the simple fact that there were people already calling for Israel to stop bombing Gaza, to stop committing an act of genocide that was already underway just weeks after October 7th. But no, we have to hand wave that away, because let's get really, this is, it's not that simple. So let's just not, we can't stop doing the thing that's happening now until we read about 15 2,000-page books on the complicated Middle East history of the Levant.
Yeah, because some things are very complicated and some things are very nuanced, but then some things aren't. Or rather, the sort of moral impetus is not this, substance of the solution we can argue, or what we do afterwards we can argue. But what they see is a bunch of Zoomers on TikTok and Twitter and YouTube and Facebook seeing a bunch of horrific videos of amputated children and toddlers under rubble. And they say, that's bad. My government should probably stop supporting that. And they start backwards from there, saying, actually, you're just a bunch of fucking simple-minded Zoomers. You really don't know the complexities of it. And who better to do this posture, right, than the sort of ultimate head-patting, pull-your-pants-up Barack Obama, who spent the better part of 15 years tissing the left student activists for being too simple-minded, for being too simplistic, too demagogic, too moralistic. In November of 23, he appeared on Pod Save America, where he sort of did the It's Complex routine. And we're going to listen to that clip right now.
If there's any chance of us being able to act constructively to do something, it will require an admission of complexity and maintaining what on the surface may seem contradictory ideas. That what Hamas did was horrific and there's no justification for it. And what is also true is that the occupation and what's happening to Palestinians is unbearable. And what is also true is that there is a history of the Jewish people that may be dismissed unless your grandparents or your great-grandparents or your uncle or your aunt tell you stories about the madness of anti-Semitism. And what is true is that there are people right now who are dying who have nothing to do with what Hamas did. and what is true, right? I mean, we can go on for a while.
Yeah, we can go on for a while, which is exactly the point. You listen to this whole interview, you listen to that segment a million times. He never actually has a position. He never supports a ceasefire, never supports conditioning weapons to Israel. It's peak Obama in that it's sort of liberal empathy box checking.
I'm really wringing my hands here, but there are so many different sides to consider and so many contradictory feelings and ideas and histories. And how do you ever reconcile that? Therefore, I guess we just have to keep sending new planes, bombs, bullets, and weapons to Israel, because otherwise, I mean, we could do this all day, man. We could go back and forth. I mean, there are kids dying, but also, I mean, remember the Holocaust, right? I mean, so what are we fucking supposed to do here?
I mean, yeah, it's really just it's the Macbeth. It's the sound and fury signifying nothing. It is, what the fuck did you just say? Because the point of complexity trolling and nuance trolling is to sound fucking intelligent and to sort of position oneself as a sort of expert. Again, sort of box check. And it was, there's this party, and you're deep, you're thoughtful, it's very complex. And then you realize that this was all sound and fury signifying nothing. What was said in this? Nothing. There was no position taken, no risk taken, no tension, right? Exposed, no cognitive dissonance, no thesis or antithesis, right? Nothing.
Because that's the point. Nuance is the virtue itself, not a way to actually dissect an important issue to reach a conclusion. The conclusion itself is nuance. It's supposed to stop the debate.
Correct, because the point is to just confuse people and have them move on to so they ignore calls for a ceasefire and to pressure Biden to end the military support for, right. And the sort of quintessence of this, and this popped up because what you got to see is that clearly we've seen this a lot over the last few months, because clearly Biden was never going to change course in any meaningful way. Again, they'll push for a temporary ceasefire to release hostages, but that's it. Nothing permanent, basically telling Israel to wrap it up and go home to end the war, which Biden thus far has refused to do. And everybody sort of knows this and sees this is happening, but at the same time, they know they have a political problem in their hand. And so you really saw this complexity and nuance troll emerge among the kind of egghead classes over the last few months, because what else is there? Nobody can defend. This is what's really fascinating over the last 5-6 months, that basically no one defends the Israeli assault on Gaza as such at all. I mean, really never, unless far right, wing media or Fox News. But like liberals aren't even bothering, even though their president is supporting it and arming it and himself supporting it. No one really defends the substance. All they have is process critiques and nuance critiques and complexity critiques and, who's to say what's what, or my favorite cop out, which is the Biden can't stop it if he wants to, sort of non sequitur critique, right? That all this is sort of hemming and hawing over nothing, because the U.S. empire is a bumbling child that can do nothing to stop the big bad Israelis who are somehow, again, who literally cannot function without U.S. munition shipments every few weeks. And so what you saw is this sort of emerging class of this fixation with nuance as a kind of virtue in and of itself. So there was one piece in January 2024 in the Washington Post by columnist Amanda Riley that really took this posture to a very cynical endpoint, where it said that in the context of Gaza, it was necessary to reject good versus evil binaries and instead embrace complexity. Riley pathologized the categorization of good and evil as a psychological phenomenon called splitting, quote unquote splitting, thus glossing over, of course, the very important political and moral dynamics of bombing toddlers in Gaza who are being subjugated and sieged as a refugee population. She wrote, quote, "One of the most helpful things I've read since the war in Gaza began was Lulu Garcia Navarro's interview with Israeli writer Edgar Keret for the New York Times. And the days after the Hamas attacks, he felt an urge to split. And he was actively fighting it, working to see the fuller catastrophe, so to speak. Quote, I think that in our souls, or our minds, or whatever you call it, there is something very complex, some ability to contain ambiguity, not to be swept away with only one emotion, to be able to inhale the complexity of existing," he said.
Man, sit with that as the bombs fall, man.
Oof, man, just sit there and meditate on that, man. That's so fucking deep. And the piece uses the kind of pseudo-psychology, pop psychology of the mind that wants to have binaries and wants to have right and wrong. And again, when we're talking about things like, I don't know, zoning laws, or whether or not this property tax should be increases, sure. But when you're talking about a war that is, by all metrics, objectively evil, right? It's a quote unquote war, right? An assault, what ICJ says is a quote unquote plausible genocide, that has seen tens of thousands of children amputate a limb. that sees tens of thousands of children ultimately going to die, that is 1 million people actively starving. This idea that this needs a ton of nuance literally serves one functional purpose, especially when the status quo continues as is, which is to make people impotent, which is to oppose the anti-war movement, the anti-genocide movement, and to stop it in its tracks, because this is not complex. This is, again, how you solve the problem after a ceasefire. Sure, that's obviously complex, but at the very least, we can agree there isn't any complexity to a totally gratuitous, totally one-sided, genocidal, bombing, siege, starvation campaign, unleashing disease campaign on a besieged population that is 75% refugees. Certainly that does not need 10,000 point PowerPoint presentation of what one does to stop that. Clearly, just stop doing the bad thing.
To discuss this more, we're now going to be joined by Natasha Leonard, a columnist for The Intercept. Her work has also appeared in The Nation, Book Forum, Dissent, The New York Times, among many other outlets. She is also the Associate Director of the Creative Publishing and Critical Journalism graduate program at the New School for Social Research, and the author of 2 books, the most recent of which is Being Numerous, Essays on Non-Fascist Life, which was published in 2019 by Verso Books. Natasha will join us in just a moment. Stay with us. We are joined now by Natasha Leonard. Natasha, so great to have you back on Citations Needed.
Oh, I'm delighted to be back. How are you doing?
We're doing well. I'm speaking for you now, Nima. Sorry.
Considering.
He's doing fine.
Do you want to nuance that a little bit?
No such thing. We don't believe in it.
We're going to problematize this.
Citations Needed is entirely just nothing but lizard brain demagoguery. Let's talk, if you would, a bit about this bad faith tactic we've been talking about today, of the idea that a sort of urgent moral issue is in fact extremely nuanced and complex is a very useful backdoor conservatism, because after all, if something requires, a 2,000-year history lesson or a PhD in political science, or is sort of full of naughty moral dilemmas and trolley problems, it gets a little overwhelming for the average person. So there's not really something that's an evil or wrong that needs to be corrected. It's actually something that's very time consuming, and it's almost a sort of chore to dissect, and therefore we kind of just all get deflated and go home. It kind of takes the momentum away and the moral clarity away. We saw this in efforts to push for single payer healthcare circa 2017 and 2019. We saw this around post George Floyd meaningful police reforms in 2020. We see this, of course, most recently with Gaza. How anytime there's a kind of consensus that something is wrong, immediately there appears to be 900 pundits that are dispatched to tell you how it's actually very complex. And it's not that it's not wrong, it's that it's also kind of right. And then the result is, of course, paralysis, which of course is kind of by design. So let's sort of talk about, if just generally, this kind of bad faith media tactic of nuance and complexity, not as something that is an intellectually honest pursuit, but as a kind of bludgeon to prevent, especially the Zoomers, from getting mad.
No, I'm really delighted to be talking about this today, especially because after this interview, I'm going to be heading into university to speak to my students about History as Propaganda by Du Bois, and the kind of long history of these kind of rhetorical and narrative tactics that appeal to offering up robust and allegedly detailed histories in order to abstract from more important, and let's call them insurgent, truths that challenge a given common sense narrative, if you will. So, of course, nothing we're critiquing here, nothing you guys have been talking about, nothing that I have a problem with is nuance per se, or the idea of attending to the complexities of an issue and a history. We're talking about the kind of bad faith deployment of calls for nuance and a refusal to actually attend to an issue by saying it is too complicated. And I think a lot of things go on when these discursive moves are put into play. First of all, it's deeply patronizing, of course. If it's coming from a media or a political commentariat saying, you, the activists, you, the people in the streets, you, the campaigners, you say you're calling for something, but you couldn't possibly understand the complexities here. It's patronizing, and obviously it does political work. It's in many cases cynical, right? It's a go home, you couldn't possibly understand. And obviously there are various occasions where members of this commentariat truly believe that, like, oh, you're calling for degrowth, of the global economy. You fools, you don't understand how to feed people going forward. And it's patronizing because obviously many people at the forefront of these movements, and not only in university settings, are acutely aware of the difficulties of achieving the kind of mass social change we're calling for, but refuse to allow problems of complexity to indeed be dissuasions. It's incredibly clear when calls for nuance or refusals to answer a question because it is too complicated are bad faith, because often you'll find the very people that are interlocutors who are in fact calling for change, demanding change, taking action, have not shied away from complexity at all. I think if we want to bring up Gaza and the people demanding an end to genocide and taking to the streets and acting for it, it's not because there is either an absence in struggle of historical understanding. In fact, there's been extraordinary writing shared from Palestinian voices, from academics in genocide studies, from international voices who understand acutely well the complexities and histories at play here, and nonetheless have no problem standing against genocide. And I think a couple of really key times I've seen this call to nuance as a reactionary and diversionary tactic deployed is certainly fiercely in this moment during the war on Gaza, and also around debates around fascism. And so it's often about the application of a term with political weight. So in the case of fascism, fascism. In the case of the genocidal war in Gaza, genocide. And then the demand for nuance and complexity is itself very intellectually dishonest, because it's pretending that terms can only be used in a precise moment or in one historical setting. First of all, that's not how language works. If we couldn't use language and specific terms called into being in political historic moments and materially specific historical moments to describe one thing and then reapply them, those terms are useless. We don't need them in circulation. With the use of the term genocide as a legal concept, but also a descriptive concept with political clout that calls into being a certain sort of response, one would hope. Masha Gessen's point that they made about the use of genocide to describe as potentially what is, and this was a few months ago, going on in Gaza, I think it would be very difficult to not say that is indeed what's going on, is that we call upon these words in order to make comparison, in order to intervene. So the calls for nuance and complexity against these sort of descriptions are then in action calls to not intervene, even if those calling for nuance and avoiding the application of these kind of weighted historical terms don't realize they're doing that. Often they do realize, but that is what they're doing. Same with describing contemporary constellations in the US, right? And Modi, the AfD in Germany, calling these fascist constellations. And then you get the, nuance mongers, the most particular nuance mongers in the last years, saying like, no, it's not fascism because it's not from the fascism region of early 20th century Germany or Italy. Then what they're denying is the possibility that language isn't just historically contained, because then it would be useless. Indeed, it works, as the great Wittgenstein always reminds us, in terms of family resemblance concepts. And really crucially, it forecloses that language doesn't just describe, but calls certain constellations into being too. So if I'm calling something fascist, maybe it's because I'm saying we need an anti-fascist response. When it feels both grounded and well evidenced that there is a genocide going on, it is not only deployed because it is descriptively correct. Surely one would hope it is to intervene with that genocide. So I think two things go on that are intellectually dishonest. It's both this extraordinary refusal to understand the way language works and meaning is made, and rejection of the possibility of language doing more than description and calling for political action, which doesn't indeed foreclose understanding complexity and being able to attend to it.
Yeah, to me, it's part of a broader kind of political posture of just tone down the temperature. Like everyone just calm down, right? You said it's inherently patronizing.
Caring and change is just hot-headed, but nuance is objective, to get back to Du Bois there.
Yeah, it's lame-o. It's for Zoomers who are, TikTok-addled Zoomers. And this is something we've talked about before, which is this kind of the anti-politics of polarization discourse, for which this is an attendant discourse, right? It's kind of very similar, a lot of overlap. And the goal is to kind of, like you said, I think you're right. It is to remove words that are viewed as being overly charged or overly tabloidy, and to sort of play off the Liechtenstein. It's kind of like the limits of my word are the limits of my world, right? It's like, so if you can't use the word like genocide or fascism, even when they are kind of overwhelmingly applicable, and even when scholars of those terms say, no, it's actually, it makes sense here, because they're viewed as being too charged, right? It's all kind of very outcome based. It's like, does it make people feel bad? This is what the New York Times kind of, they've even said this explicitly, I think. Like, if does it seem too charged? Does it seem like too provocative? Only for America and its allies, obviously for China and Iran and Russia, you can sort of use whatever you want. But for those who are kind of considered in the good standing of the West, as it were, you have to use language that's toned down because it's viewed as being too charged. And I think that's where a lot of this kind of discourse comes from. The second that you use a word like genocide, you kind of foreclosed on nuance, rather than, again, like you said, no, some people can very, very nuancedly come to the conclusion that something is genocide. And simply saying we can't because it makes us feel bad is both like incredibly childish and also extremely convenient.
Right. And the idea that, but there is a difference between one historic genocide or the Shoah, that was the reason the term genocide got created as a legal term and established as a legal term. Oh, because it is not exactly this. The term doesn't apply. I mean, simply that means that we aren't allowed to use concepts at all, because not every single reference point is exactly the same. So that's obviously absurd. It's, do we have validity in applying the certain abstractions we do in order to navigate the world? And of course, we absolutely need to if we're going to move through the world. You know, we're also at this moment where a lot of the same centrist commentariat and political voices are saying, oh, you know, we live in these uncertain times. Gosh, the uncertainty. Who could know? I can't possibly point to knowing and understanding because there's so much that is unknown. And of course, there is a lot of uncertainty. I'm not denying that there's uncertainty and that attending to complexities and difficult things that we need to figure out and build knowledge around is crucial. But what that does in the same way is this really diversionary, obfuscatory work of meaning we're not attending to what we're actually pretty certain of. And there's a lot that we're actually able to view with the understanding of seeing it work as a set of certainties. And I really like what Wittgenstein does in his late notes on this issue, which is like point us towards the difference that we might understand between knowledge and certainty. Not to get too in the weeds of this because we're trying to talk about contemporary media, but there's a lot of things that are carried out, not because people have sat down and done lots of research and learned a lot, but because we're trained in certain modes of presumed action and certainty. So things are taken as givens, as hinges by which we live, and you could call the bedrock of how we organize society. So border regimes, capital's compulsions, racial hierarchies, patriarchy. These are not things that people learn through endeavors of knowledge. They're held as certainties that then need to be dislodged. So when people point to complexity and unknowing and what we don't know and so much uncertainty, I actually think we should be pretty aware and careful about what is taken as given and what is certain. And it's often the nuance mongers who refuse to do that work. So it's in fact them who are failing at the ruthless criticism of all that exists, to call upon Uncle Carl, which would probably be not considered very nuanced of me to cite Marx so casually. But I think we can also remember that it was when Marx called for the ruthless criticism of all that exists, and it's such a fabulous call. What he meant by ruthless, and I'll continue the quote, is not being afraid of the results it arrives at, and in the sense of being just as little afraid of conflict with the powers that be. So those nuance mongers are absolutely not engaging with the ruthless criticism of all that exists, which is what they seem to allege to be doing. They're doing quite the opposite because they are quite afraid of conflict with the powers that be.
Yeah, I love this idea that there are just these kind of givens in the world that really can't be sussed out, right? They are complex, they're inscrutable. And I think along with that, I mean, as we've been saying, but along with that is just even the idea of confusion, that itself is a state of being that media consumers or the voting public or all people everywhere are just in a constant state of like not actually knowing what's right or how they feel about anything because they don't have all the information, and how the media uses this idea of like mass public confusion in a really kind of tautological way, right? So the public doesn't want this thing. Like, oh, we've seen, or polling shows, or I spoke to some cab driver, and the public doesn't want this thing, but also not investigating the fact that the media keeps reinforcing the fact that that thing that now they say they don't want is totally impossible. So it's always self-reinforcing. It's that these things that could be better can't be better. And here are all the reasons why. And then when there doesn't seem to be mass public support for those things, it's like, well, see, that's why they don't want these things, right? Things are complex, totally unknowable to the public. And therefore, you can't do this very simple thing, which is either give people health care or stop genocide. So to get kind of specific about this, one of our very favorite people here on Citations Needed is John Chait. He is a major practitioner of this mode of writing. Back in 2018, he was hand-wringing about single-payer healthcare, and he wrote this, quote, "In reality, single-payer has always been and remains a political dilemma that no one has been able to resolve, and there is no evidence the resolution has grown any easier," end quote. So, hey, nothing to be done. It's super complex. So, Natasha, please, if you would, if all movements for change, for justice, for peace, for anything, if they're all so complex and therefore equally politically unpopular because no one actually understands them, how is it that our media keeps getting away with just shaping public perception of what is possible and deliberately, through nuance trolling, foreclosing maybe a slightly different, more just future?
Well, I mean, it's just based on Chait's wisdom. It's really quite extraordinary that anything has ever happened at all. Most notably, of course, what was at the time very unpopular proposition of ending chattel slavery. So, yes, the idea of, well, it's very complicated and the economy relies on this, but also you can't have it. And so why did you ask? Also just presumes people don't rise up. We've seen this recently. And yes, it was very much those of the Chaitian persuasion who've condemned during 2020 not the kind of robust calls, which I completely support, for police and prison abolition, but even defund. And I think the media creating political perceptions on the behalf of the democratic establishment really did shut down any burgeoning efforts from those sites to pull vast funds away from cops and prisons and put them elsewhere. So you actually see like the kind of political work this kind of rhetoric and discourse does. But at the same time, in these debates, when you get stuck having them, and it's absolutely awful because it's just so annoying. If I were to say I'm an abolitionist and stop Cop City, don't let the mass police training faculty be built in Atlanta, I support that movement, it's brilliant, and police abolition is very reasonable, obviously you get the immediate, well, what are you going to do with the murderers and the rapists, as if that's the role prisons serve, but also as if you are saying something absolutely unconsidered, as if it's kind of just appeared in my head for the first time as a fun idea, and if I think it can happen overnight. Whereas obviously you speak to any abolition, any activists, any prison abolitionists, any scholars of abolition, people talk at length. Marion Kaba is one of the most powerful among them about the kind of work that needs to be done to be put in place such that abolition becomes a very feasible, practical proposition. And they offer very, very kind of specific material ideas and suggestions that could be actionable. So, yeah, the people who say, what a bonkers, baseless, bananas thing to suggest, what would you do without prisons? You see the cynicism, because as soon as someone gives steps towards a paradigm shift that are actionable, as you're saying with single-payer healthcare, it's like, oh no, those steps don't lead to any sort of continuity towards your goal, so let's not even try those steps. So it is a kind of act of constant foreclosure from the jump.
It's also an asymmetrical burden, right? Because those who are asking for more cops in cages to solve social problems, which again is not a nuanced position, it's a demagogic position. They're never said they need to come up with a 10-step feasibility process. I mean, I think a lot about how over and over and over again, when these so-called progressive DAs get kicked out of office, or in the case of San Francisco, get recalled, substance abuse and homelessness increases anyway. And they say, well, I don't understand. It's like, well, yeah, because you just made an assertion that you could arrest your way out of the problem. And of course, there's never any kind of complexity or nuance required from that position. It's just more cops in cages is kind of assumed to be true. Just as, again, you didn't really have to have a nuance and complex 10-point PowerPoint explaining why you needed to invade Iraq. It was just, well, that's the way it is. So it's, again, I think there's an asymmetry of complexity as well. When the president does his State of the Union and says we need to fund cops 10 different times, no one sort of demands a feasibility study about how that's supposed to work. It's just taken for granted that it will.
Colin Powell decided to do just that PowerPoint, though, and just filled it with lies. So you could also go that route.
Yes, you can either lie your way into performed nuance with granular, detailed lies that nonetheless rely on taking a lot for granted, right? And that brings us back to this kind of question of the undergirding certainties of contemporary life that we might want to keep, we might want to shift, depending, we have to attend to them. So yeah, what gets held reasonable and not necessarily required to be defended through endless calls to complexity and knowledge are the very things that indeed are worthy of challenge and can be challenged with all their complexities and historical specificities. But I don't see that being a lack on the left. I really don't. I don't think the ability to appeal to historical insights, economic insights, political insights, and the details of how they interact, I definitely don't see that lack. So the assumption that it is not there is obviously more than patronizing. It is oppositional, antagonistic.
I want to talk about it as a rhetorical mode as well, if you'll indulge me, because I think Paul Ryan for years was kind of presented as this very complex, nuanced guy because he had 500-page PDF policy papers about how he was going to put grandma, on cat food. And there's this kind of theater to it. And you see a lot in kind of reportage, right? This sort of, you could come up with the most conservative pro-cop. You can, do what Jeffrey Goldberg did at the New Yorker in 2002 and kind of launder a bunch of Bush administration, Dick Cheney propaganda. But as long as it's 10,000 words and it's, it has the kind of gravitas of complexity, there's an aesthetic here as well I kind of want to talk about. And you see this a lot in academia too, where it's like you can listen to a 3-hour lecture or read a 10,000 word piece that is not technical, but it's ostensibly political. And you're reading, you're like, wait, what was being said there? There is I think an aesthetic of nuance. There's an aesthetic of complexity that is really about, aside from what we talked about earlier about kind of stopping movements in their tracks, is really kind of a professional brand, for want of a better term.
And performance.
Performance. And again, which is not to say that some things aren't complex. Like, anyone who's read a kind of richly detailed, complex historical book, for example, even if they don't agree with its politics, can understand the importance of that.
We are not anti-complexity on Citations Needed. Just to be clear, nuance is good. It's actually the thing we like talking about the most.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
But the performative bullshit of nuance.
Yeah, there's a performative aesthetic to a lot of this. Again, you see this a lot anytime there's any kind of social movement, especially one that can't really be contained by traditional media organs, whether it be around Ferguson or George Floyd or Gaza or these kind of other social movements that don't fit neatly into this partisan box. This aesthetic becomes very popular. And I want you to talk about that aesthetic, specifically in the kind of think tank academic world, where one sees it as well as the media one we've been talking about.
Oh, yes. No, I think partly that's to do with the neoliberalization of the university, right? It has some economic structural groundings there, and that when you get fields that are ultra specialized and there's a kind of gerontocracy of tenure, so everyone needs to very specifically and with absolute granular detail respond to an existing framework within a discipline, an existing argument within a discipline, and tweak it, but only just so much so that you're still performing the kind of deference to your chairs and your committees. And so I think there's a kind of very, given the adjunctification of university labor and what that demands of people, and means the demand of nuance almost as don't make too much noise because you ain't going to get a job, I think does have an effect here. There's this fun sociology paper that was being passed around Twitter, X, whatever, not that long ago, called Fuck Nuance. And I was like, oh, I got to look it up. And the author, whose name is Kieran Healy, had this very fun and I think accurate, points out a number of things that can be wrong with nuance as deployed in the specific discipline of sociology, but also notes this aesthetic aspect of it, which is that sensitivity to nuance is a manifestation of one's distinctive, often metaphorically expressed and at times seemingly ineffable ability to grasp and express the richness, texture, and flow of social reality itself. This is the nuance of the connoisseur. It is mostly a species of self-congratulatory symbolic violence. And I thought that was a kind of very nice description of how you see certain types of nuanced performance and complexity performance play out that don't necessarily do anything particularly wrong unless they are, in the end, an evasion of making claims that are absolutely grounded and important to make, either by virtue of cowardice or actual comfort with given paradigms of thought such that you don't feel the need to undo them. And then, you can spend all your time being nuanced and picking through the different shades of disagreements. Because nuance that's like the French word, right? Like shades, color shades.
Well, yeah, I mean, nuance really in service of the status quo, that it is, something is so complex or you nuance it to death. But really the whole point is just paralysis rather than progress in any kind of way. As you've been saying, completely dismisses all the complexity and nuance that gets to progress or that drives movements for change, to be kind of hokey and jargony about it. But just actual radical progress or movements for justice, that is all built on such nuance and complexity, just to contend with the fucking reality of power and the reality of reality, right? To get to a place. And that is so dismissed so that only the nuance remains. And when you just have nuance remaining, then it's too complex to do anything. You can't possibly move forward.
And you just have a sort of very myopic set of descriptions, right? Whereas I think against nuance, as nuanced is used, disposition also understands that change doesn't happen because I've explained things best to you. Change happens because of, also complex in its shapes, forms, and navigation, but action, like how we act together, the activities we engage in together that can disrupt the riverbeds of assumption of the givens, and discussions around nuance and complexity keep all of our thoughts and what we're talking about really in the realm of description and discourse and debate. And obviously so much of change happens outside of that terrain. And I think the nuance mongers don't really think about that enough, and nor do they want to, because that's also part of a paralyzing force. And also, be it just even in the discursive fields, too, not just, taking to the streets, organizing together, picketing, blockading, boycotting, all the various activities that don't really require in their instantiation discussions of nuance all the time, even if they have nuanced grounding and complexity of thought behind them. There's a lot going on that we don't and should not, even if we could, always defer to nuance. A child having a leg, hundreds of children having legs amputated and arms amputated without anesthesia.
Right.
Yeah, there's a complicated history that leads us to that point, but there is nothing complex in the moral articulation of what needs to be done in response to a situation like that.
Yeah, because it's fundamentally ahistorical, because we've talked about this before, but there's this kind of Whiggish view of history that labor laws and civil rights laws are kind of passed down on high from good government Protestants, rather than being responsive, reactive. And broadly speaking, social change in the last 150 years, or maybe forever, has dealt in broad strokes. It is not preceded by nuance, that the nuance needs to follow the broad moral demands of X amount of people or X population, and that labor strikes or social unrest or the riots of the 60s leads to the reforms of the 60s and the 70s, or the fear of communism is what led to national healthcare systems in Europe. That it does deal in broad strokes. And then once you make a sort of political decision to do X that's considered progressive and good for people, whether it be, again, something that's pro-labor, or whether it's the 5-day work week or whatever it is, that the lawyers and the eggheads go figure out the details later after you've made the decision. And what seems to be, again, I think rose attendantly with neoliberalism, is that we reverse the order, that the eggheads have to sort of approve of something, or the wonk types have to kind of agree with something or run the numbers prior to it being sold as a kind of moral imperative. And that historically is just not how change happens. It's not even how it happens today, even with the neoliberal paradigm.
Right. And I also, quite simply, what an affront to populations facing under genocide, populations facing starvation, populations being rounded up at the border, people being denied the healthcare they need, or being able to have the identification that is accurate to their gender. How dare anyone demand that they respond to their needs of survival and flourishing with a nuanced argument? There's no argument to be had there. There are, of course, complex histories that brought us to this point. And how is it to be done to overthrow those violent paradigms? Complicated. But when demands for nuance are directed at the most oppressed and the occupied, the blockaded, and the genocided, I'm like, nope, you can hold your nuance.
Yeah.
Yes, there's actually you sent me to read just before we spoke an article in the Jerusalem Post by a West Bank settler that was one of the more disgusting. I mean, hard to know where to start with what's been put in the media and it's disgusting to read in the last months, but just this appalling piece saying, oh, I can be nuanced about the fact that I think all Palestinians are terrorists. It's like, well, what a cynical article. But yeah, like the most vile weaponization of this idea of nuance. It's like, oh, no, I will be a fascist, but I will be nuanced in explaining that I understand what you're thinking.
Yeah, I think you can nuance all the way to full fascism, right? And actually that leads me to final question here, considering you've written about fascism a lot, Natasha, but you also are working on a new book, which you referenced earlier. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on, and so all the Wittgenstein TikTok kids can get excited?
Yeah, my Wittgenstein gang. I have to think of a fun, like, hive-based name for the 3 people that will read this book. It is a book that I am behind on for extraordinary reasons of us having to organize and try to stop American US dollars going to fund a genocide. But I am looking at the way in which establishment media and political voices use and deploy the idea of uncertainty and risk prediction unknowns in a way that I find very particularly unhelpful and indeed pernicious in this moment. And that, as I mentioned before, that we should be attending to some of the more ingrained certainties organizing our given time and how they differ from things that we know and how they differ from knowledges. And it will be a little journey through some Wittgenstein, some Gramsci, Black radical tradition, Charles Mills, brilliant feminist scholars like Sophie Lewis, trans historians like Jules Gill Peterson. Yeah, sort of to survey the terrain of uncertainty and how we might want to rethink it.
We're definitely going to stay tuned. I think that's a great place to leave it. We've been speaking with Natasha Leonard, columnist for The Intercept. Her work has appeared in so many publications such as The Nation, Book Forum, Dissent, and The New York Times. She's also the associate director of the Creative Publishing and Critical Journalism graduate program at the New School for Social Research in New York City, and the author of 2 books. The most recent is Being Numerous: Essays on Non-Fascist Life, which was published by Verso Books in 2019, and look out for her new one. And we will have you back on to talk about that, I'm sure. Natasha, it's been so great to have you back on Citations Needed. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Yeah, I think there's something very clever about, because again, nuance is such a objectively important thing. Like, no one's going to be anti-nuance. Right. Unless you're like Donald Trump, then you're sort of overtly anti-nuance. So again, it's such a clever way of taking this rise of the wonk class, right? The kind of rise of the professional, very sort of middle management, MBA types, lawyers, those types who sort of who've taken over politics more overtly in the last 30, 40 years. And playing to their narcissism and playing to their lack of ideological commitments, right? These are not people who come from meaningful political organizing. They don't come from unions. They don't come from radical politics of any kind. They don't come from politics they're not sort of motivated by politics. They're motivated by the game of politics, the kind of West Wingification of politics. It's sort of a fun thing you do for sport before you rotate into working for, Amazon or McDonald's or whatever. And it plays to that because, again, when you start from the premise that it's all about sort of implementation and clever policies and coming up with large PowerPoint presentations, you really avoid discussions of ideology. And that's what people want to avoid. They want to discuss why we're doing politics at all. Why are we not working on Madison Avenue selling Toyotas or toothpaste? Why are we in politics? And that's a fundamental question of, you were born with the world a certain way and you want to leave the world a certain way. And you want that world to be better than the one you were born into. And that's why you get into politics. That's why people should get into politics. That's, of course, not why most people do. And whatever that ideology is what's important. What are your priors? What are your sort of ontological primitives, as they say? And I think that's why the sort of nuance troll is so powerful, because it really does play to elite media institutions. It plays to educated professionals who don't really think about those questions. The government is sort of this thing that kind of just exists. And yeah, you don't want Donald Trump. You don't want the president going on Twitter and talking about Fox News's host menstrual cycles or something embarrassing. But ultimately, it's kind of just this thing that happens. and it needs to be tweaked, it needs to be managed.
But fundamentally never really changed, right? So you kind of get this technocratic, evidence-based worldview and the rise of what we've seen in media, right? You know, evidence-based journalism or evidence-based philanthropy, yada, yada, yada. And so you kind of do that, but then you do it enough that you break through the part where actual change can happen, or you have an actual idea about doing something that doesn't suck. And now you've gone too far. So no longer is the devil in the details, but actually like nuance serves as like the death of change being in the details, right? There's too many details. So therefore nothing can actually happen. It's not just complex. It is unsolvable. It is impossible to change. And that is what nuance trolling does. It makes a virtue out of nuance and complexity in and of itself. That's the thing. That's the deep thought that is had. And it goes no further than that into actually changing the material conditions of people's lives. That's a bridge too far. That's too much. How are we possibly going to get enough people to support us to do that? It's too complex. It's too detailed. People don't want the details. But if it's too simple, well, then you don't actually know what you're talking about. So therefore, how are we going to implement policy? Because you haven't spelled it out. But once you do spell it out, well, now it's just too complex. It always jumps over the sweet spot, that kind of, Goldilocks reality of, oh, well, you've spelled it out just enough, and enough people are on board that that's what we can do. And somehow that sweet spot, that just right, never exists.
Yeah, well, and that process took 5 years. That process took 5 years, and everyone moved on. Because politics is fundamentally, it's ideological. It's also very emotive. It's an emotional thing. People have emotional reactions to moments, right? People coalesce around things like Emmett Till or George Floyd or pictures of dead kids in Gaza. Like there is a sort of psychological and emotional component to it. And that's good, because usually that psychological and emotional component, again, barring certain obvious exceptions, can speak to our better angels. It can make us want to make the world better.
Yeah.
And you can harness that desire, that fundamentally good human desire to make the world better, for good things. You can take things like the destruction of World War II to build national healthcare services, or things like the uprisings in inner cities in the 1960s to pass the Civil Rights Act, or the assassination of JFK to pass the Civil Rights Act, or, Medicare. And when you take that emotional moment, that sort of populist moment, and instead of directing it into good things, you sort of nuance it to death. So a few years go by, and then we say, the sort of wind got taken out of the sails. Let me move on to the next thing. And that's fundamentally what liberalism, when it's done badly, does. It takes things and it kind of turns it into superficial reforms. It names a few streets. It does the kente cloth kneel, and we kind of move on.
And then you just cool your jet so that we can get back to reality.
Right. When liberalism works, dare I say, as a leftist, obviously that's off brand, but when liberalism works, when it actually sort of does its job, it takes that and it actually changes people's lives for the better. And that you take the emotional heft, you take the sort of populism, the sort of outrage, whatever it is, and you direct it into things that are actually good. And that's liberalism working. Unfortunately, liberalism rarely does that anymore, because the other thing's much cheaper, much easier, and much better for Wall Street.
Right. And that's why, we can't have good things out of it. No. It's too fucking complex. That will do it for this episode of Citations Needed. Thank you all for listening. Of course, you can follow the show on Twitter at CitationsPod, Facebook, Citations Needed. Become a supporter of the show if you are so inclined. And we hope that you are, because we are 100% listener funded. You can do that through patreon.com/Citations Needed podcast. And as always, a very special shout out goes to our critic level supporters through Patreon. They include Brad Hayward, Zach Cathcart, Lorenzo Mitchell, Ben Lazar, Morgan Green Hopkins, Ed Zitrin, Corporate Zombie, Eric Joyner, Buzz Among Us, Stinky Pete, DL Singfield, J.M. Geralt, Chris Vincent, Nigel Kirby, Scott Roth, Porter Shutt, Zachary Henson, Josh Durlam, Joe Wengert, Steely Dan Halen, Douglas, Danger Manley, Green New Neil, Trasdat, Brickshop Audio, Supple Old Man, David McMurray, MSP, William Rush, Garrett Geiser, Political Zombie, Extra Domum, Gwendolyn, Kyle, Heather Redacted, Kevin Bowman, Anna Marie Kane, Jason Eason, Chris Sarah, Dash X, James Michaela, Greg Westney, Drew Johnson, Max Belanger, David Bettner, Brendan O'Connor, Ultra Miraculous, Zappo, Sturm Wyvern, Darren Brady, Bart DeCourcy, Ra, Max Wilsey, Blake Bunell, Xenia Zidvornik, Tatiana Maslany, Tsukimi Yuki, Psychic Pizza, Panic Emoji, Brendan Hines, Doc Reitzel, Philip Moss, Rulo's Bar, Jameson Salzman, A Very Throwable Brick, Bitcoin, Wallet Inspector, Shockfist, Weedlord, AI Scare, Backups Care, and of course, Computer Scare. I am Nima Shirazi.
I'm Adam Johnson.
Citations Needed senior producer is Florence Burrow Adams. Producer is Julianne Tweeten. Production assistant is Trenda Lightburn. Newsletter by Marco Cardolano. Transcriptions are by Mahnor Imran. The music is by Granddaddy. Thanks again, everyone. We'll catch you next time.